a very good time, I think, to talk about anything related to the BRI, most obviously because this year will mark the 10th anniversary of its official announcement. For my purposes today, this year will also mark the 10th anniversary of the start of civil war in South Sudan as well. As it was conceived, and I think as it developed initially, at least until 2018, I regard the BRI as a type of multifaceted grand strategy, but my interest today will be in large part inverting that to ask what this means for recipient or partner states and take some of the implications concerning development and security a bit deeper. A decade on from its announcement, of course, the BRI exists uncertainly in a very different, even transformed global landscape, as well as in Africa and indeed China as well. A lot of debate clearly about whether the BRI has peaked in Africa. China has much changed coming out of, or trying to come out of the pandemic, the shadow of Ukraine on the map of the global map of the BRI, debt crisis amid failure to agree with current G20 debt negotiations, and debate about the shift from the BRI's boom to what some would characterize as a bust, or at least a very different landscape. So whether or not the BRI is dead or dying, I don't think it's either. It's clearly transitioning into something else at a very different, more competitive global time. As well as a good time to consider this topic, I think this is an ideal place to do so, in view, amongst other things, of Professor Chan's work on religion in the BRI, but also Professor Palmer's project, which I think is on Chinese modernity and soft power on the BRI, which I find fascinating, and I hope to indirectly engage through some historical context. I have to be clear at the outset, I'm not a BRI specialist, but I'm looking forward to contributing and to learning today as well. Before I begin, my thanks to Luna Chong as well for her help in setting this up. This is a big topic, clearly, especially when we look at the continent of Africa, and the abstraction that has always adhered to the BRI, I think, is compounded by the abstraction in many Africa-related discussions, which is why I think we need to talk about Africa as an entity in BRI terms. I'll come to that shortly, but I think we have to ground it in specific places and concrete dynamics as well. I'll combine some general thematic context and background with a particular case of South Sudan. But what I'd like to do in this presentation is essentially three things. First of all, I'd like to situate Africa in the BRI and beyond in various ways, with a particular interest in development and security dynamics and how these have evolved and are evolving in China's foreign policy, but also more generally. Second, then, I'd like to consider the evolving relationship between security and development in this context, in terms of how China has changed this, but also how China's engagement is impacted by various factors in Africa. And finally, using the case of South Sudan, I want to argue for the necessity and the value of approaching the BRI from the margins. That is, not starting in Beijing or some of the obvious places in Africa, from Kenya to Nigeria to South Africa, but a case like South Sudan, I want to argue, illuminates some of the difficulties in understanding the BRI, but also I think some of the necessary complexity facing the initiative as implemented and as a lived, applied reality in places around the world. I think there's value in decentering a top-down approach to China's foreign policy. I think this raises many questions about the BRI and its associated parts that I can't touch on, like the digital Silk Road, particularly the practices that are involved, as well as the politics that this generates. South Sudan, I want to argue, shows clearly the political benefits of belonging to the BRI for participant states. The BRI clearly, however, is a means towards other ends and fits very much into a historical pattern of the incorporation of external assistance for domestic political purposes in African states. I think this is fascinating partly because it poses so many challenges about the topic and its framing, because clearly the BRI is quite different depending on where you look at it. Africa seems to be prominent in the BRI, but is not as central to the scheme as many seem to think. And that applies particularly to cases like South Sudan, which in many ways are the margins of the margins. So if possible, I'd like to contribute to work on BRI partners or the agency of participant states, but also to situate the BRI in a thicker context, which I think is overall marked by intensifying global competition, which likely will have serious repercussions for the politics of development and security going forward. Turning then to the Africa context, getting beyond the abstraction of the BRI, as I mentioned, is a real challenge, considering its global scope, considering its landed manifestations, manifestations underground, on the sea, indeed in space. China's assistance to different African space programs is one part of this, not to mention the various Silk Roads, and a whole expansive set of dynamics that the initiative seems to potentially encompass. Added to that, and very interestingly, I think in security and development terms, are the intriguing combination of material dynamics and ideational concerns. It's not just large-scale concrete infrastructure that you can see and visibly touch. It's also some of the normative contestations that the initiative gives rise to as China seeks to expand notions of normative influence in the realm of peace and security, and maybe more generally as well. But on the face of it, the African continent seems a bit unlikely to be part of the BRI as a notional revival of the Silk Road in purely geographical terms. Perhaps someone in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or another branch of the Chinese government remembered Zheng He's voyages between 1406 and 1433 and decided that because he went off to the coast of Somalia, for example, the continent might be a good place to incorporate. But clearly interior Africa doesn't conform to any historical geography of Chinese exploration, but perhaps Zheng He's voyages helped to change that. More applicable perhaps to current concerns, I think Africa is interesting due to how the BRI seem to transcend and maybe displace the sense that Africa had a certain prominence in China's foreign policy with the global South. There was a sense of Africa standing out in China's regional engagement, even if, of course, let me be clear, it was at the bottom of a hierarchy for Chinese foreign policy concerns in which relations with America and the neighborhood clearly predominated. But the BRI and Africa in China's global engagement, I think, changed dynamics in quite interesting ways because of its incorporation into China's global geography and intent, at least notional. It's also interesting, I think, for the way in which the initiative has conveyed the political intent by China's and African leaders, as well as media hype about its transformative development potential. So many high claims were made about the potential for the BRI, and asking what's happened since the high watermark of these claims is an interesting question, because not so long ago, the BRI in Africa was the next big thing. It generated a lot of excitement, and it seemed to be the project of the century in an African sense. Today, it still attracts such coverage, of course, at least in official media, but the context has changed so much that instead of the project of the century, people are asking whether it was the project of the decade and maybe what comes after as well. In terms of how the continent has entered and developed within the BRI, it's important to recognize the multiple ways in which multiple Africas participate. The BRI has been formally mainstreamed into the continental FOCAC process, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, most recently seen in November 2021 in Dakar, where the FOCAC process really incorporated the BRI fairly enthusiastically across the board, including in terms of the African Union Commission's participation as well, and in terms of efforts to link projects to not just China's own objectives, but also the African Union Agenda 2063. As well as this continental participation, There's been a lot of interest concerning Africa's regional economic communities and the buzzword of connectivity, such as infrastructure corridors, for example. Almost all African states have formally signed up to the BRI. What that means in practice, I think, is a question I'd like to raise a bit later, with the great exclusion, of course, of Eswatini for obvious political diplomatic reasons. One of the fascinating things about the BRI, I think, is the way in which it has been recalibrated and evolved in the context of various controversies that importantly predate the COVID pandemic, but of course have been compounded by that, specifically concerning infrastructure financing, but also a range of issues I'll touch on shortly. What's interesting as well is the way in which, as the BRI was incorporated formally into the continent, it was changing, combination of continuity and dynamic evolution, in which the appearance of other rival initiatives undoubtedly had an impact. Therefore, we necessarily have to study the BRI in relation to other external initiatives and put African agency at the center. But clearly, there are many questions about what has changed, what is changing, as well as what remains of the BRI today and going forward. There are still transformational claims made about the initiative. Most seem to be articles of faith or future expectations rather than based on empirical reality. One reason for skepticism about the harder transformation narratives, I think, concerns just how China has changed in economic and other terms before and after the pandemic, but also clearly questions about future infrastructure financing in the context of a debt crisis for certain African countries, general sustainability concerns, and other debates about the environment, governance, and other issues that all add up to a much more difficult, challenging time for the BRI. Most interestingly, I think, for the purposes of this talk, is the general sense of a shift from the type of biggest, best, large-scale, expensive infrastructure projects to what we've had more recently in the context of declined Chinese overseas development finance, a sense that smaller, more targeted, selective infrastructure projects are more normal going forward, and that the financing modalities have changed as well, away from the old days of Exim Bank and other big policy banks financing large projects towards more mixed forms of financing, public-private partnerships, for example, out of an effort to ensure that the projects are better financed and maybe more sustainable as a result. But this broad shift, I want to suggest shortly, might be interpreted through a historical lens as a parallel to a shift from a type of modernization or high modernist development in Africa from the 60s. So there are historical parallels, I think, to this shift, even if the current circumstances are very specific. So what we end up with is a sense in which the BRI is very present, but at the same time absent as well. For example, the new information portal on the BRI by Xinhua is essentially a repackaging of existing content. It's nothing particularly new, so it can be hard to decipher what's really happening. The second theme I'd like to turn to very briefly concerns Africa beyond the BRI. Africa in the BRI is an established phenomenon, but beyond the BRI is essential to consider, starting with historicizing the connection, because clearly the BRI follows on from various historical development initiatives and phases in the continent, from which it can't be separated for very important reasons. For the purposes of today, my particular interest is in how China is the latest champion of claims concerning the links between economic development and security. I'll suggest shortly that China has its own conception of these links, but in many ways, China is joining a historically familiar debate about that theme, as well as development issues in the continent more generally. If you want a reference, then the Decade of Development from 1961, which President Kennedy announced at the UN in January, parallels, for example, what we're in now, which is Africa's third industrial development decade until 2025. So many of the themes about big infrastructure and development were prefigured at different phases of African history. So how the BRI intersects with other initiatives in history is one theme, but clearly the historically produced political economy of actually existing African development today is very consequential when it comes to outcomes and impacts of the BRI in the continent, its regions, and its individual countries. One of the historical layers also, of course, concerns China's own engagement in the continent. And one reason to use the case of South Sudan is because South Sudan predates China's going global, China's oil engagement in South Sudan, that is. It predates going global. So the BRI is overlaid onto not just other external development initiatives and those from within Africa, but also other Chinese foreign policy initiatives as well. In terms of Africa beyond the BRI, the global context in February 2023 is much changed and rapidly changing. For the Chinese government, at least, one way to consider this would be in terms of the rise of the East and the decline of the West, variations on that. But clearly the dominant theme today is the spectra of a new type of Cold War, not a new Cold War, a new type of Cold War, in the context particularly of intensifying US-China competition, but also the consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine as well. In more direct terms applicable to the BRI, much attention is dedicated to its rival initiatives of various kinds, most of which face questions about the extent to which their rhetoric or claims is matched by reality or actual finance. But nonetheless, the sense is very much of strong competition in which it's the BRI that other states and entities are responding to. BRI has been a path leader in that respect. The African continent has become rather busy in terms of very high-level engagement from American and indeed Russian officials, as well as, of course, China's foreign minister's traditional visit to the continent in January of this year. But the geopolitics of rival infrastructure initiatives has become very consequential as one manifestation of this higher sense of developing global competition, which will be very consequential for development going forward. But one particular theme to mention here in passing is the importance of African debates and perspectives on these questions of US-China-led global competition, because it reflects to a long-standing issue about whether Africa can incorporate China into its own development agenda, or if China's incorporating Africa into its global development agenda as well. But clearly much debate, high dilemmas about what many would regard as the imperative of not taking sides. And much could be said about that. But for me, that's more the framing context, because there is an important sense in which Africa beyond the BRI is important to consider due to China's own evolving global engagement, which overlays new initiatives onto the BRI and generates new questions about how they're related in the process. Most obviously, of course, the Global Development Initiative, which has been incorporated into FOCAC already, framed very much, of course, as supporting the AU Agenda 2063, as well as the UN's Sustainable Development Goals as well. But secondly, of course, the more recent Global Security Initiative, which I'd be willing to bet will be incorporated into FOCAC 9 in Beijing in 2024. Now, we have just had the GSI concept paper released. This remains rather nebulous and hard to fathom, aside from the the public presentation of this, but there is a sense that these new initiatives, like the BRI, when it was initially conceived, I would suggest, is a kind of blank slate for China's evolving engagement in Africa and more generally in the developing world. And perhaps there are benefits in new initiatives because of the baggage that the BRI has attracted over the past 5 years or so. My particular interest concerns the way in which the BRI emphasized economic development and connectivity, but came to be prominently associated with China's expanding security engagement in Africa. So securing the Belt and Road Initiative became a major theme in the continent long before Ukraine really radically interrupted the BRI's European aspirational geography. Security in the Chinese government sense, I'm speaking generally, trying to summarize, has a very expansive understanding encompassing traditional security dynamics and so-called non-traditional security dynamics. I think there are 11 components of Chinese President Xi Jinping's big security concept from 8 or 9 years ago. But from a relatively marginal status, security was mainstreamed into almost all levels of China's engagement with the continent, starting with FOCAC and official interstate relations, but extending right down to local dynamics of state-owned enterprises or individual Chinese entrepreneurs' activities in some countries as well. Clearly, one result is a contrast between the role of Africa in China's global security engagement on the one hand, and on the other, China in Africa's peace and security architecture on the other. And our interest in these related but very different entry points can depend upon prior existing interests. But to this, I would add that, of course, China is only one of a number of external powers amidst this sense of intensifying competition for more established partners, but those that have more recently become more engaged from Russia to Turkey and others as well. The particular set of questions that interest me most, I think, concern very prominent claims from China's leader downwards concerning the efficacy of development as solving all problems. Development understood primarily in economic sense, but at various points, very strong claims have been made about the ability of economic development to produce security, indeed, as the highest form of security. These have been made in the BRI context, of course, but also more recently in the Global Development Initiative context as well, where we see the same motifs made, even if these have been qualified. And I think one question concerns how the stronger versions of these claims have been diluted somewhat to qualify these, to modify them, to add caveats, because when such claims are applied in African context, at least, clearly reality is more complicated. But when we think back to historical layers and how China joins an established debate, I think the relationship between development and security that China comprehends is a bit different from standard debates about the nexus between development and security. And in a paper with a colleague, Lina Ben Abdallah, using Mali as a case study, we argue that China redefines the very notion of security in developmental terms into a kind of security, a different type of security development nexus with Chinese characteristics, to summarize very briefly. And China has sought to popularize this, to mobilize support for its conception of development and security, to really champion the claim. Now, many people would agree notionally with the presumed causal relationship between economic development and security, or the production of peace. understood as more than the absence of fighting. But when we apply this and test this to actual cases, it becomes much more difficult and harder to sustain. And that's why I want to incorporate the case of South Sudan to try to illustrate some of the challenges this claim about the link between development and security faces in reality, but also in the process to try to offer a different window onto what I think are important BRI dynamics and dynamics beyond the BRI, which is the view from the margins, the BRI through smaller, unique states and the types of agencies that they can exert in influencing the BRI, but also in benefiting from the BRI according to their own agendas. One good example would be Djibouti, small state agency, and how it leveraged its position to attract, among other things, China's naval base. But the reason I'm interested in South Sudan is because I've been visiting since 2004 when I first started working there. South Sudan clearly has a particular elevated status in China's relations with Africa and indeed the world through China's oil connections from 1995 onwards. But I think it's also a very revealing case for the types of interconnections and histories that I tried to incorporate earlier in this presentation. The South Sudan context is clearly challenging as the world's newest state. Last year, it celebrated its 10th anniversary of its independence in 2011. It's marked by many intricate and complicated layers of historical interventions, as well as protracted conflict. One of the more aspirational interventions in development history terms even featured European fantasies about the ability of Chinese imported labor to construct game-changing infrastructure projects in what became Sudan in the late 19th century. China's direct presence was never really there, but indirectly, this was one part of the development imaginary of 19th century Sudan as it became, at least in 1899. It's very hard to overstate how severe the challenges facing South Sudan were and have become since the eruption of the most recent civil war in December 2013. Civil war, perhaps even in itself, would be a simplification in a much more complex conflict. But clearly, South Sudan and Sudan has a very particular elevated place in China's foreign policy in the region, as well as its corporate engagement through the pioneering role of CNPC in Sudan's oil development in the 1990s. So for China, there are multiple layers on top of the other multiple layers that China encountered when it engaged South Sudan more seriously as a sovereign equal diplomatic partner from 2011. Right now, we have a polycrisis. We have a notional peace agreement. There have been some formal steps in the right direction towards implementing it, but all sorts of other challenges as well. And it's exceptionally sobering just to see some of the facts about this, the extent of displacement, the extent of conflict today, but also the intensification of flooding and other environmental factors, which don't help at all. But the real context, to simplify horribly, is chronic underdevelopment, despite maybe because of oil and the particular type of kleptocratic petrostate politics compounded by ethnic division and power struggles that this produced. And of course, the issue of debt and how to finance development infrastructure in a context where the country has its own power sharing government, but of course has had a large UN peacekeeping mission since 2005 and more particularly 2011. It's also a dangerous place with a recent travel warning to Chinese visitors from earlier this month. And I just apologize for having to speak in very general terms about something so complicated. But clearly, infrastructure challenges and development has been a major issue for decades. Indeed, dating back to earlier in the 20th century, this is a very historically familiar theme. The implementation of infrastructure has always been far harder. And whereas China, Sudan, or South Sudan relations are standardly approached through the prism of oil, I want to use a different example to consider South Sudan in and beyond the BRI, the example of roads, but be clear that this very much relates to the core of China-South Sudan relations, which remains oil, but feeds into China's efforts in the BRI and outside the BRI to develop a type of development engagement that goes significantly beyond oil and encompasses a broader range of development concerns as well. So first of all, South Sudan is part of the BRI. It's formally, at least, I think, for the past 5 years. Transformational claims continue to be made, for example, by South Sudan's ambassador to China about the potential for the BRI to transform the prospects of South Sudan. Interestingly, I think it's not just the BRI within South Sudan's legal sovereign borders, but in the context of East Africa as a region that also plays a more indirect role, including infrastructure projects in Kenya, but also neighboring countries from Uganda to indeed Sudan as well. So it's very much part of a regional geography of BRI engagement at the same time. And in theory, quite strong and optimistic claims are made, including by Chinese analysts, about the ways in which South Sudan can use the BRI as a means to develop itself as part of a regional development engagement with the East African community as well. But what's partly interesting to my mind is just how difficult it is to separate out the BRI and BRI projects from other Chinese projects, and then from South Sudanese agendas as well. It's really not always clear what is a BRI project and what is not. And I can give various examples about that, but that's partly why it's a challenge to identify what the BRI actually means in concrete localized form because of this mixed information. One example of a project touted as a BRI project, and I'll complicate that shortly, is a road, a state-of-the-art asphalt road project built by the Shandong High-Speed Company, whose first stretch linking the capital of South Sudan, Juba, to a town, Terekeka, about 63 kilometers, was finished and formally opened by South Sudan's president in December last year. This is presented as a BRI project at times, including by South Sudan's Minister for Roads and Bridges, who maybe predictably was quoted as saying it's part of the BRI, a key part for that. And this road is, I think, interesting for all sorts of reasons as a microcosm of the BRI, but also because of one of the first things I was told by a new Chinese economic counselor to China's consulate in Juba before it became an embassy in 2011, which many of you will recognize, which is the phrase, if you want to develop, first build a road, or if you want to get rich, first build a road. So road building and development, of course, has always been importantly connected, and not just championed by China, championed by many, including a former head of the UN mission in South Sudan, for whom roads were absolutely central as part of what was considered to be the most important aspect of development, which was developing an effective central state with the ability to project power using roads and infrastructure, as part of a previous incarnation of a state building attempt in the country. The recently completed stretch of road means that a journey that used to take about 5 hours to reach this small fishing town now takes about 40 minutes. And of course, this is welcome by many, but controversial by others. What seems to be a BRI project isn't always a BRI project and has historical layers and associated politics. When President Kiir opened the completed stretch of road, this was presented more in terms of his own accomplishments. He paid suitable homage to China, of course, but this was very much presented as part of his achievements. He'll stand for re-election in 2020 next year. The project importantly predated its formal BRI status. And we could go back a lot further than the Chinese incarnation of the project, because the actual road had been planned even before China became involved in South Sudan. But the original groundbreaking ceremony had been in 2014. The road had been interrupted because of the conflict from December 2013. It was enabled subsequently by an oil-backed loan agreement from 2018. And its construction was marked by notorious controversy. For example, massive flood damage in 2020, which took out large swathes of the already completed road. And that's just normal in South Sudan. But because of the status of the project, raised particular questions about quality control as well as future sustainability of the road. But if we invert the BRI to put South Sudan and South Sudanese protagonists at the center, then clearly this road and other associated projects is an important part of Salva Kiir's government from a strong political and security logic, which comes first. Even if the developmental benefits may be foregrounded, there are underlying political and security imperatives behind such logics. And this means that the BRI has been, clearly and not unexpectedly, I might add, very much part of extroverted South Sudanese politics in the context of a multi-stranded Chinese engagement since 2011, but also South Sudan's more general relations with external powers as well. And that's partly why I think you would expect and had with this road a kind of performative homage to the initiative, to the BRI. But essentially, this is part of an investment-seeking strategy to market South Sudan as being attractive to further Chinese investment. So the question of what the BRI has meant, what it means, and what it will mean for South Sudanese political elites going forward is quite different, I think, from what it means from the view through Beijing. To further add to this sense of confusion, but maybe possibility, South Sudan is now also officially or formally part of both the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative, at least according to China's current ambassador to South Sudan as well. But what this actually means, I hope someone can enlighten me, because again, it seems to be the case that South Sudan has signed up or has been formally signed up to these new initiatives, as well as the BRI. But the practical implications of this are very much yet to be determined. But there is a sense that from South Sudan's perspectives, and there are many, this particular road project was also very controversial, or the view from the margins, clearly we end up with a very different set of dynamics and questions about the BRI as a grand, multifaceted global strategy. And in many ways, on the ground, what we see is China reinventing the wheel of South Sudan's development history, insofar as it faces the same type of intractable development challenges that previous external partners and domestic governments have faced in the past, with a difference that China champions this argument that economic development can produce security, as that has been applied in South Sudan in various ways, in China's direct engagement, in its indirect engagement, and under the UN mission for South Sudan more generally. Most people would like to agree with this in theory, but in reality, it ends up being an article of faith because it's just simply far harder to actually put that into action, much less sustained outcomes in development terms as well. And the end result is a kind of tragic juxtaposition of the type of neo-modernist transformational dreams concerning what infrastructure can do for development, and then the continuing reality of conflict, of chronic underdevelopment, and the scale of challenges that mean any development project is ambitious, to put it mildly, but of course not to minimize the hopes for security across the country and in the region as well. I'm speaking in quite general thematic terms on a very complicated case, in a very complicated BRI incarnation, added to which we have these other iterations, but I hope at least that this can generate some questions and food for further discussion. As I'm reaching the end of the allocated time, I'll just conclude with a few remarks to try to restate and maybe expand upon aspects that I've covered today. The BRI, in terms of its grand announcements, I think has been clear. Since 2018, of course, it's been fairly clear that it has reduced political salience within China. It's sort of disappeared or been put on hold. Maybe there will be another BRI forum this year even. I think there was supposed to be, and maybe we'll learn to the contrary. But there is a sense that it has waned after waxing quite significantly until about 2018. But while the general strategic terms of the BRI and its accompanying buzzwords were fairly evident, on the ground, from cases like South Sudan, indeed the continent of Africa, the situation is much less clear because China's intent and that of its partner states is always refracted by the politics of recipient agency and other agendas, meaning outcomes are uncertain. And indeed, in my particular interest today, the relationship between development and security, much less certain than the degree of certainty as proclaimed in official announcements. This is not unusual. This in some senses is very historically familiar, but it does temper, I think, some of the stronger transformative claims made about the initiative in general in Africa and in specific African states as well. One theme I've tried to raise is really the challenge of separating out the BRI from prior existing histories of development of various kinds, as well as China's new engagements as well, the GDI, the GSI. And this becomes even harder in the context of the current juncture in the continent and more globally, marked by very much by intensifying competition led by the US and China, but also featuring other protagonists across the developing world as well. So it's hard to separate the BRI from other initiatives, but how it relates to other Chinese initiatives becomes an issue going forward. Formally, the GDI and GSI have been added as an extra overlay onto the BRI as part of a sense of hybrid connections. But what this will mean in substantive terms going forward has very much yet to be made clear. I've tried to problematize the political claim that development solves all problems and can produce security as the highest form of security indeed. And I've tried to argue that this claim, when it's squared with hard cases like South Sudan, becomes more an article of futuristic faith because it lacks convincing grounding in the actual realities of intractable conflict, as South Sudan reveals only too vividly. China is but the latest champion of this claimed connection between development and security, however, but in many ways, the trajectory of China's engagement with this mirrors previous engagements. It has its own characteristics, of course, but it also has its own resonances with previous engagements to maybe dilute the distinctiveness of this latest iteration of a historically familiar theme. The future of the BRI, at the end of the day, of course, is uncertain. One theme which I think tends to be neglected is how far different African influences will matter in terms of co-shaping the initiative going forward, and how far the African Union, regional economic communities, and individual states can and will try to leverage it for their own development initiatives going forward. Part of this was seen in Addis Ababa earlier this month with the African Union discussions there. But it's an important question to consider going forward in the context of vigorous African debates about the need for Africa to call the shots more and for it to assert its interest more productively vis-a-vis China and other external partners, including these various rival initiatives in the process. How the BRI proceeds in Africa going forwards is thus very unclear. If we approach the BRI from the margins in places like South Sudan, it's exactly the same as you'd expect. But this is a reminder of, I think, part of why the BRI is so interesting as a connecting theme, because of all the complexity that it generates. I will stop there and look forward to comments, questions, and to being educated about other perspectives as well. But for now, at least, thank you for your attention. And I'd be more than happy to follow up as applicable after the Q&A discussion. So thank you very much.